Yeah.
Thank
So,
you.
good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to present here a summary of a dozen years of research in the Southern Caucasus, namely in Eastern Georgia, by the Foscari University of Venice in collaboration with different Georgian institutions. To all of them, we are extremely grateful. These are the Georgian National Museum, with whom we worked in the field from 2009 to 2017 in the Shida Kartli region, in the framework of the Georgian-Italian Shida Kartli archaeological project, GSCAP, focusing on the Middle Kura Valley, River Valley. We are still continuing to work on the materials of the Shida Kartli region for the final publication and for special studies. Second, the Lagodekhi Regional Department of the Ministry of Culture, Sport and Youth, the Lagodekhi Museum, with whom we are working since 2018 in the Lagodekhi municipality in the framework of the Georgian-Italian Lagodekhi Archaeological Project, GLAP, focusing on the Alazani Plain. We also have a collaboration of different type with Tbilisi State University, so an Erasmus plus ICM and overseas agreements, which allowed us to organize exchanges of teaching staff and especially students. In these years, we have been active on many fields, on many fronts. Most of them still represent work in progress, and preliminary results are dispersed in different publications. I think it's therefore useful to provide an overall view of what we achieved until now, and so to say, how the different pieces of this research fit together. So our group comes from the archaeology of northern Mesopotamia, northern Iraq and the Khabur region of northeastern Syria, and was originally specialized in the later 4th and 3rd millennium BC, the end of the late Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age in the chronological system in use for Upper Mesopotamia. We were therefore especially attracted by the theme of the change in relations between northern Mesopotamia and the Southern Caucasus during the pre-KURA-ARAXES, KURA-ARAXES, and post-KURA-ARAXES periods, as the KURA-ARAXES culture is the only culture of Caucasian origin until the early 1st millennium BC with the Urartian kingdom. So the first culture that in its expansion phase came into direct contact with and even sort of penetrated or surrounded, as you can see from the slide, the territory of northern Mesopotamia. We found it therefore interesting to investigate the wider framework of interregional relations, which gave origin to this apparent anomaly and later led to its dissolution. We focused on the Kura Basin in the Shida Kartli province, which previous research had shown to be very rich in sites of these periods, like Quatzkelebi, Zanantgora, Berikl Debi, just to mention a few. And we worked on 3 sites there, all of them located in the central part of the basin at a maximum distance of about 70 kilometers from each other as the crow flies, either directly in the river valley, so OKHERAKHEVI and ARADETIS ORGORA Doglauri, or a few kilometers to the north of it, NATSARGORA. The aim was to collect evidence from a variety of contexts, settlements versus cemetery and different environmental conditions, so the river valley and the hills, and a variety of chronological subphases in order to put together a regional periodization able to be compared with the ones in use for northern Mesopotamia. We decided to integrate important Bastille and published material from earlier excavations in the region by Georgian archaeologists in our work in order to make it available to the international scholarly community. We soon realized, however, that some of these sites had been occupied in later periods, in particular in the late Bronze Iron Age as well, which have therefore also been incorporated in our research. We also realized that none of these sites had in fact a complete sequence. The slide shows a synopsis of our activities. So in the text, in lighter gray are the periods or levels which are attested but at the sites, but not dealt with by our excavation. The state of publication is the following: final publication of the KURA-ARAXES cemetery of KHASHURI in NATSARGORA appeared in 2012. The volumes about the Georgian excavations at the KHASHURI NATSARGORA settlement and at the early Bronze Age cemetery of Doglauri are expected in the next future. And the rest is still work in progress, but numerous preliminary reports and special studies have been published about all of it. First important point on which our research focuses is that of chronology. As we have often already highlighted, there are major problems both with absolute dates, which are still few, sometimes old and imprecise, and fraught with methodological problems. So sample choice, pretreatment, precision, calibration, and especially modeling of dates. But there are also problems with often missing accurate descriptions of their context of excavation and associated material. There are, however, equally serious problems with relative chronology, that is, with defining an agreed sequence of archaeological cultures or cultural complexes. This depends on the poor or conflicting definitions of these cultures and of their material correlates, as well as from the dearth or poor control of stratigraphical sequences, and last but not least, terminological misunderstandings. All this not only hinders the creation of a reliable C14 supported chronology, but also makes the synchronization with the neighboring areas difficult. This I already illustrated many times, but it shows how the terminology in use for the Southern Caucasus lies in between the ones used for the Northern Caucasus and the Near East, so that definitions are sometimes misunderstood. So our strategy for tackling this with this complex matter was to produce C14 supported regional periodization, drawing on the results of our investigations on different sites in close interaction between archaeologists and C14's experts. So name Elisabetta Boaretto of the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel, through sample collection by C14 specialists on the field, precise on-site context characterization, careful a posteriori selection of samples to be dated. So out of more than 500 potential samples collected, we ended up with less than 100 analyzed ones, and then Bayesian modeling of calibrated dates, but also by the archaeologists in particular, a parallel revision of the associated ceramic sequences and precise definition of diagnostic elements. The first results of this complex operation had been recently presented at the international workshop Time and Cultural Changes in the Southern Caucasus, where do we stand with absolute chronology from the late Chalcolithic to the Iron Age. This took place in Venice in January 2022, and all the contributions can be seen on YouTube at this address if you are interested in details. So in summary, in our region, we managed to set some reliable chronological benchmarks with good associated stratigraphic ceramics assemblages for the central and later part of the KURA-ARAXES period, so about 3100 to 2800 BC, which is well attested at both sites, NATSARGORA and ARADETIS, about 60 dates in total, and for the long period between the transition, Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, and the Middle Iron Age, so from about 1500 to 700 BC, about 25 dates, with few more sporadic dates for the intervening phases, early bronze, middle bronze, so the early Kurgan period, and middle bronze, for which we, however, managed to create a sequence of stratigraphic diagnostics. We also better defined, based on compared stratigraphy and quantified ceramic data, the limits between the different cultural assemblages and provided, we hope, a more precise terminology for their descriptions. These are some tables that I will not comment upon about the general C14 dates that we collected. This is the general sequence of the best dates. Some outliers have been not considered, and then this is the KURA-ARAXES sequence. And this is the sequence for the other periods that we are still working on. So we soon realized that even our best site, which is the multi-period mound of ARADETIS ORGORA, which has a 14-meter high accumulation of anthropic layers spanning from the end of the 4th millennium BC to the 6th century AD, does not have a complete uninterrupted stratigraphical sequence. Besides well-attested periods, which are these two, KURA-ARAXES and Late Bronze Early Iron Age, there are in fact several short hiatuses, periods of intermittent or sporadic occupation, and phases whose occupation is heavily disturbed. And they both occur, they occur on both the two areas of excavations, which are on the opposite side of the mound. So they seem to represent the general tendencies of the settlement. However, this allowed us to reconstruct a pottery periodization, but in some cases not to anchor it to good C14 dates. This is a point which is worth carefully reflecting on, as in fact it concerns most, if not all, multi-period sites in the region, and thus brings us back to the necessity to integrate evidence from many more different sites, if possible within a collaboration between different excavation teams, if we really want to build a reliable regional local chronological sequence. So I will now proceed to present our main results for each phase and illustrate a few case studies, starting from the KURA-ARAXES culture. As none of the Shida Kartli site we investigated, we yielded any evidence for earlier, so chalcolithic occupation. I'm sorry for people who were at the lecture on Monday, because some of the things I will present are the same I presented there. So for the KURA-ARAXES period, we have data from two settlements, NATSARGORA and ARADETIS ORGORA. And there are two cemeteries, NATSARGORA and Oglauri. ARADETIS lies, as we have seen before, in a dominant position on the Kura River Valley, and it is a small but important regional center. There, in Field B, we unearthed a tightly packed 4-meter-high sequence of KURA-ARAXES layers with 6 main occupational levels, with phases, which yielded remains of buildings of different shapes and in different building techniques. From phase 6, the first on the virgin soil, came a typical wattle-and-daub hut of rounded shape equipped with a polylobate earth. Phase 4 yielded the most important discovery. So what we interpreted as a small village shrine that was of a rectangular shape with rounded corners. It had a carefully plastered, white plastered floor with traces of a clay earth here. And the wall was built of clay, so not bricks or cob, but just clay. On the floor lay a smashed KURA-ARAXES jar and these two almost complete unique vessels, probably in the shape of water birds, one of them with traces of painted decoration. You see it in the picture on the left and in the drawing. The palynological analysis of their content strongly suggested that these zoomorphic vessels contained wine for ritual purposes, as their spectrum, so the polynic and the palynomorph spectrum, was identical to that of historical and modern homemade wine. On the other hand, the jar appeared to have contained cereals on the basis of palynological analysis. Then from phase 3 came the remains of structures with rectilinear wattle-and-daub walls, heavily burnt. They have been destroyed by heavy fire. And from phase 2, at least two round shaped huts equipped with benches and fixed earth. There is an interesting detail that a row of these large stone slabs was standing in vertical position against the outer face of the wall of the first of these huts. And this is a detail that we didn't find any parallel of in the whole KURA-ARAXES architecture repertoire in Shida Kartli and elsewhere. So I don't know if some colleagues have other examples. The second site is KHASHURI NATSARGORA, a small mound joined by a flat settled area. This lies on a secondary route leading in northern direction from the Kura Valley to the mountains of the Greater Caucasus, in an area occupied by smooth hills and valleys, mostly developing in east-west direction. Distance from the Kura amounts to 7 kilometers, so it's very near to ARADETIS, about 15 kilometers as the crow flies, but the landscape is slightly different. In the 21st, 30th century BC, it was the seat of a short-lived KURA-ARAXES village, only a few decades earlier and partially contemporary with ARADETIS. The KURA-ARAXES level was only 50 centimeters thick, extremely disturbed by later pits and foundations, as well as by pervasive bioperturbance. The excavated area yielded a sequence of external surfaces with clay plastered surface with remains of rather ephemeral structures in two different building phases, very near to each other chronologically. Some round-shaped huts in cob blocks of mud bricks like this one, provided with fireplaces and earth, and then a large, some wattle-and-daub huts or palisades, and a large number of both internal and open-air firing installations of different types. We have the typically Shida Kartli and polylobate fireplace on up top left, but we also have rounded semicircular ones, curved or rectilinear horse-shaped ones. The soil micromorphological analysis of these prepared surfaces confirmed that they're used in cereal processing activities and more occasionally in animal husbandry. So we have a sequence of plastered floor plus phase of use consisting of a black material, which is the refuse of cereal processing and cyclical firing activities and occasional passing by of animal. So to sum up, in spite of the small excavated surfaces and of the bad preservation of the archaeological remains, the two sites revealed an unsuspected variety in KURA-ARAXES architectural plans, techniques, and installation, even in the same or in neighboring sites and over a short period of time, something that we are further investigating. So the KURA-ARAXES funerary customs could be analyzed on based on the cemeteries corresponding to the two settlements. Both of them had been excavated by our Georgian colleagues. NATSARGORA, with a total of 26 excavated KURA-ARAXES graves excavated by Alexander Ramishvili, and ARADETIS ORGORA cemetery's name is Doglauri, with 79 excavated graves excavated by Yulonga Goshidze in different years. So although we do have C14 dates only from Doglauri to prove this, the finds, Potter in particular, leave no doubt that these cemeteries were in use in the same for short period of time, and were contemporary with the relevant occupational layers. NATSARGORA therefore was only slightly earlier than Doglauri and of shorter duration. Grave types and burial goods are very similar as well. We have pit graves and pit graves lined with cobblestones, often covered by a heap of cobblestone, and these are the only attested types of graves. The only significant difference still to be explained is in the very different proportion of individual versus collective graves. The collective graves have remains of up to 6 different individuals, and we tentatively interpret them as family graves. They contain at least partially articulated skeleton of the last buried individual and commingled remains and commingled and partial remains of previous depositions. So the individual graves are virtually exclusive at NATSARGORA, only one collective grave, but they amount to nearly half of the sample at Doglauri. On the contrary, burial goods are quite similar, I would say almost identical, if not for the fact that the assemblage from Doglauri is slightly richer, both in number and in variety of items. And I listed some possible explanation on the bottom of the slide. We are not sure which one better fits the evidence. Maybe other sites, evidence from other sites could be usefully compared to this. So pottery vessels which were generally placed in front or around the skull may have contained food offers and other items, most of which, as far as we could ascertain, because our evidence was only excavation photos and descriptions from the excavators, besides the objects. So most of the other goods were found on the body. So we think that they were personal belongings of the deceased and not offers. We are presently working on the final publication of the Doglauri early Bronze Age graves, and have started at the same time a program of multidisciplinary studies on these graves, for which we managed, or those graves, few unfortunately, for which we managed to collect sufficient material for specific analysis and in collaboration with different specialists. So we have a palynological analysis of the sediments, determination of by Eliso Kvavadze of Georgian National Museum, determination of human remains by physical anthropologists, joint work by Lia Bitadze and Francesca Bertoldi, paleopathological and paleonutritional analysis by the same, stable isotope analysis by Paolo Iacumin and Estelle Herscher. We are also thinking at DNA analysis and so on. So these analyses are also carried out for the sake of comparison on human remains from the late Bronze cemeteries of the same sites. Both sites have a huge late Bronze cemetery as well. So the slide shows some integrated results for one grave, 2015-02, which is a collective grave that we witnessed to its excavation. We were present, so we could collect samples. And this contained a 35 to 45 years old female individual in primary position and sparse bones of two other individuals, a young male and an older female. Burial goods consisted of 2 ceramic vessels and a few ornaments. The main individual suffered from serious osteoarticular and oral pathologies. The palynological sample we collected 4. So the one from beneath the skull contained some light blue fibers of flax cloth, which may represent the remains of a colored scarf. And in the sample collected from the abdomen area, we found a huge amount of pollen of edible plants, for instance, walnut and nuts, and this was joined by pollen of medicinal plants. This is the only sample among the many palynological ones that we collected from the site, which contained these medical plants. So we think that they were possibly deriving from tisane or potion the person drank. Obviously, it was of little use. So both vessels, the vessels contained pollen of sowing cereals and weeds, phytoliths and parenchymal cells of wood. So it was, the interpretation was, the hypothesis was that they had contained some cereal food which had been cooked on an open fire as something like some sort of porridge or mash. So this is for the KURA-ARAXES period. Then let's go to the other periods. Sandwiched between the early Bronze and the Middle Bronze Age, the post-KURA-ARAXES early Kurgan period represents another important focus of our research. Unfortunately, relevant evidence is not so rich. As of the 2 cultural groups or subphases, Matkopi and Bedeni, only the Bedeni phase is attested in stratified and even rather disturbed contexts. We have only 3 not very precise C14 dates. They suggest, however, a time between 2400 and 2200, maybe a bit later, BC. Settlement occupation in this period was present at both settlements, but unfortunately in very poor conditions or explored only over a limited surface. And only 2 burials, one at OKHERAKHEVI and one at Lauri, could be attributed to this phase. At NATSARGORA, after the abandonment of the KURA-ARAXES village, there seems to be a hiatus, followed by a Bedeni layer consisting almost exclusively of pits, which cut the KURA-ARAXES levels, and in their turn, they are very disturbed by later pits. However, these pits contained, especially the ones which were excavated by Georgians. These are the only 2 that we excavated ourselves, on the left, on the right. So they contained on the right, from material from the Georgian ones, they contained a very good ceramic assemblage of reconstructible vessels of both fine and coarse wares. So this situation of pits is typical of our Bedeni sites as well, which yielded only pottery-filled pits or ephemeral structures, and they have been interpreted as possible seats of periodical ritual ceremonies involving the consumption of food and beverages. In our case, this interpretation may be supported by these facts. The elaborate pottery repertoire, and also the presence of complete vessels in pits, and the recovery of some terracotta reliefs. There are at least 3 different ones, depicting a sort of supernatural entity with obsidian inlaid eyes. These are the pieces, and these are attempts of reconstructions by Georgian archaeologists and by ourselves. They are not identical. There are at least 3, and they differ in details. The material from the old Georgian excavation at NATSARGORA the settlement is presently being revised for the final publication. So the Bedeni occupation at ARADETIS ORGORA was apparently a bit more substantial, as proved by the presence of a thin and rather disturbed layer in both the soundings that we excavated on the two sides of the mound. Unfortunately, the excavated areas surfaces were too small to recover much more than a small corpus of pottery sherds. By the way, it is important to observe that ARADETIS lies only 1.5 kilometers away from RECTILINEAR, which is one of the few excavated Bedeni settlements in Georgia, and the material we recovered is absolutely identical. The collected funerary evidence for this period is scanty, but nevertheless quite interesting. We excavated one Bedeni kurgan from a kurgan field at OKHERAKHEVI, and this is a typical example of the Shida Kartli manifestation of this phenomenon, so Bedeni kurgans, which are rather modest on the whole in comparison with the gigantic kurgans of Kakheti. The kurgan was small with a low overground chamber squared shape, and this contained only 2 vessels, numerous obsidian flakes. They were also mixed with the cobbled cover, and very few tiny fragments of human bones, among which also one tooth. Much more interesting is a single Bedeni grave from Doglauri cemetery. This represents, as far as I know, a unique case up till now. This is a stone-lined pit graves, not a kurgan, comparable in shape to some KURA-ARAXES graves in the same cemetery. So the shape is, the layout is identical to the KURA-ARAXES ones. It contained a single individual with a moderately wealthy burial goods, but all of them are characteristic of the Bedeni cultural assemblage. We could unfortunately have collected no C14 sample from this grave because the bones had been dispersed, but we think that there is no doubt that this is not a KURA-ARAXES grave. In other terms, this shows that in Shida Kartli at least, the change in burial customs appears to have been more nuanced and gradual than generally admitted, and it included the presence of transitional situations and a certain degree of hybridity. It also confirms that the ARADETIS ORGORA site was not completely abandoned in the Bedeni period. So I can conclude my review about the results of the early bronze, middle bronze transitional period by briefly mentioning the archaeometric study of the 2 pottery assemblages that we have recently published. So shortly said, in spite of the use in both cases of local clays, the study highlighted very clear differences in manufacture as concerns fabric quality, KURA-ARAXES 1 fabric and Bedeni 2 different fabrics for fine and coarse wares, and choice of tempering materials, and surface treatment and firing technology preferences between the 2 groups. As I said in the beginning, the original chronological scope of our research was progressively widened as much as during our excavation we came in touch with evidence from different periods. The first half of the 2nd millennium BC, so the Middle Bronze Age, is very poorly documented, only at ARADETIS ORGORA main mound. Only a few sporadic sherds of late Trialeti pottery, the painted sherd on the bottom, were recovered, and and they were out of context, and we found an ephemeral level of the final mid-bronze period with remains of pits, huts, and firing installations. Temporary occupation by mobile groups is a possibility to be considered, possibly supported by the unusual abundance of obsidian and animal bones in these layers, as you can see in the photos on the right. These are from a very small sounding. So we have neither funerary evidence nor geometric dates for these periods. On the contrary, our evidence for the long period from 1500 BC until 700 BC is much larger, but it is heterogeneous in both quantity and quality. Our interest in these phases is more recent and work is still in progress, but we can nevertheless present some preliminary results. Besides publishing the results of our own excavations at NATSARGORA in 2011 and 12, and ARADETIS ORGORA main mound 2013-2016, and besides analyzing some special besides having carrying out some special studies that I will show some examples, we are mainly interested in completing the Shida Kartli pottery sequence and C14 supported periodization, and in having a longue durée view on some special issues, such as those of the economic choices of the local population and their relations with the natural environment. For these periods, we are not publishing the result of all Georgian excavations. These are published by Georgian archaeologists, although we are collaborating with them for some special analysis with the Georgian scholars responsible for the publication. So our main issue in these for these periods, one main issue was defining the features of the different archaeological cultures of the period, so the so-called Chashenzi, Telgori, and Sant'Avro cultures, and the chronological and geographical relation between them. The comparative analysis of the stratified pottery from both excavations area at ARADETIS allowed us to set some firm points in a sequence characterized by a strong continuity in ceramic development. So we have now a sequence from ARADETIS to whom we anchored the material from the other sites like OKHERAKHEVI and NATSARGORA. So while at ARADETIS, while the lower part of the sequence was excavated only in small soundings, for the upper part we have larger exposures, always not very large, but larger, with remains of some structures, mostly terracing walls and external areas equipped with complex open-air firing installations and refuse areas. The resumption of fully settled life in both areas can be dated to the transition between the Middle Bronze Age and the Late Bronze Age, which can be attributed an absolute date between the end of the 16th and the first half of the 15th century BC. While some ceramic types considered characteristic of the late bronze Chashenzi Telgori culture, such as nail-impressed vessel bases, make their first appearance in the transitional phase, we came to the conclusion that the most reliable diagnostic element for the beginning of the new culture is the sharp increase in wheel-made pottery. Within the Chashenzi Telgori culture, we distinguish an early and a mature phase, which is best represented at the site, larger exposure, and extends until the end of the 12th century BC. The 12th century is especially characterized by the presence of the so-called meligele vessels, so these small sort of bottle-like narrow-necked containers. At the end of the 12th century, so in this context, zoomorphic handles and open bowls make their first appearance And both these types will be characteristic of all the following levels. And they mark, in our opinion, the transition from the late Bronze Chashenzi-Telgori tradition to the Iron Age regional pottery tradition that we identify with the Sant'Avro culture, which is also distinguished by the lighter gray color of the pottery. So the late bronze pottery is more black, the dark gray black, the early iron is more gray. And contrary of the opinion of some earlier scholars, therefore, the chronological succession between these two ceramic cultures seems clear to us. The Iron Age sequence at ARADETIS is, however, still unsatisfactory. The earlier part, so the 11th, 10th century BC, although represented, gave very little ceramic and no radiometric dates. There is a better attested phase between in the 9th century and 8th century BC, and then there is a apparent hiatus from 700 BC to the Hellenistic period, when a large palace was built on the hill. We think that possibly before building the palace, there were some terracing or cleaning works which obliterated the intervening layers. So the late Bronze Age is characterized in the whole region by renewed settled occupation. And this is attested at ARADETIS ORGORA as well as at NATSARGORA, but at NATSARGORA the relevant levels had been all excavated and removed prior to the arrival of our expedition. In both excavated area at ARADETIS, this process culminates in the mature phase of the Chashenzi-Telgori culture, where there is some planning in settlement layout, which include some sort of monumentalization by the erection of massive terracing walls at the Mount's periphery, probably with the aim of expanding the available space for a growing population. So they are not fortification walls, but terracing walls. A portion of one such wall, this one in area B, which belongs to level 10, dated to the 13th century. And this was about 2 meters wide, and the external face consisted of large, carefully flattened stone blocks, while the interior, you see in the left, was consisted of stone rubble. So this wall delimited an open space equipped with a complex firing installation. This was made of a large central earth, this square one, surrounded by smaller similar installations, and this was repeatedly rebuilt in the successive phases. Some example of different phases. This is the earlier one, and on the right is the latest phase with only one fireplace. All of these installations, and there are some more in the other excavation areas, we will see, had the same structure. So they are quadrangular or circular in shape. They are delimited by a low clay wall. The bottom is a flat surface of burnt clay, which was frequently remade, and it was used as a cooking plate. So it was generally underlain by a layer of pottery sherds, which in its turn overlay a layer of small pebbles. And this sequence was repeated all over again. On the right is a schematic section of one of the fireplaces. The secondary earths were often filled with a thick layer of ashes. So similar installations are said to be common in the late Bronze and in the Iron Age of the Southern Caucasus, but all the published examples that we could find, here some from Sant'Avro and Gracliani, all of the first millennium BC, are in fact inside the rooms, and they are covered, so they are ovens and not earth, although they have some auxiliary installations which are similar to ours, while observations made in the course of the excavation make us quite confident that in our case, they are most of them open air installations. Only in one case we found possible cover, and in some cases we found the top of the surrounding wall. So there is no doubt that they were open on the top. So this is also an interesting question to be analyzed. Just to the north of this firing installation in this part, in front of it lay a low quadrangular platform with one step, topped by a small white plastered basin. Is the one in the arrow, the white plaster had been removed, so this is only the preparation in the photo. And inside this basin, we found some burnt bones of peculiar animals, so fish, birds, and equid bones. And close to the platform lay two complete vessels, a small jar and a handled bowl in the shape of a water bird. So this suggests a possible ritual function, so that this platform was a sort of altar for sacrifices or something like that, possibly connected with the nearby firing installation. Alternatively, and considering that this area is located at the very periphery of the settlement, this area may represent some sort of neighborhood cooking area. A profane use is more probable for the contemporary remains, firing installation remains unearthed in field A in level 10 on the opposite side of the mound. So here the excavated area included parts of 3 different spaces dedicated to distinct functions. The limits and layout of these spaces slightly changes in the 2 main subphases of level 10, which are in the plans. So this is only one phase. The southwestern part was an open space occupied by an inclined surface abutting the mound's slope, and is occupied by a large number of shallow pits cutting each other. The eastern half of the excavation area was occupied by a large plastered platform of compacted clay. The top whose top was occupied by numerous fire installations similar to the ones that were found in the other excavation area, but here they were joined by some grinding installation. Finally, the space to the northwest was an open area with no formal floor, which contained the superimposed layers of mixed waste, including a remarkably large amount of animal bones and other organic materials, interspersed with thin layers of clay. So they were, each refuse layer was covered by a thin layer of clay. And this was also confirmed by preliminary soil micromorphological analysis. The archaeological analysis of the animal remains revealed that the bones mostly belonged to crania and extremities of the main domestic species, so pigs, bovids, and caprines. This is a typical feature of deposits which contain the remains of primary butchering activities, which presumably was carried out in a nearby area at the periphery of the settlement before transporting the remaining part of the animal to other places inside the settlements for proper butchery work on them, focusing on the meater skeletal elements. This interpretation is suggested by the good preservation of the bones, which implies that they were deposited and buried fairly rapidly, rather than being allowed to accumulate on the ground surface, where they would have been exposed to physical weathering, such as changes in moisture and temperature and bites by animals and so on. So undoubtedly, the layout of this area suggests activities of food preparation on a scale which exceeds the individual family and suggests some sort of coordination and planning, such as had not been, to our knowledge, observed at other contemporary sites in the vicinities. So therefore, we are continuing our work on firing installations at ARADETIS or ORGORA by trying to join different approaches, among others, soil micromorphology on the left and experimental archaeology on the right. We tried to reconstruct some of these fire earths. We are focusing also on the development of firing installations in the course of the Bronze Age, from the KURA-ARAXES to the late Bronze, in connections with the changing socioeconomical organization of local population. A somehow similar approach aimed at exploring the long-durée evolution of different phenomena from the early Bronze to the late Bronze Iron Age on the same site or territory guided us in other in-progress research. For instance, although we are not going to publish the late Bronze Iron graves of NATSARGORA and Doglauri, we are collaborating with the Georgian colleagues who prepared the final publication of the graves of these periods by these are examples, by analyzing the human osteological material and by attempting an integrated analysis of data, so to compare pottery and other artifact types and various types of artifacts coming from settlement and graveyard contexts, and by carrying out C14 determinations. Preliminary results already revealed a significant change in burial customs, as in the late Bronze Age, in contrast to the KURA-ARAXES period, individual burials are the rule for all classes and both sexes. Stone surrounded graves are not typical also. So even if in some cases the remains, like in the photo on the right, the remains are disarticulated, there is always remains of just one individual buried. And there are different patterns in the position of the burial goods as well. Pottery, for instance, is much more numerous. There are some pits filled with pottery associated with the graves and so on. So from the analysis of the human bones, we expect also further results concerning the long-term demographic trends in the same micro-region. Further studies which integrate material different periods and different sites are those about obsidian provenance. They confirmed that Chichiani is the almost exclusive source for all the Shida Kartli sites, regardless of their period, contrary to Kakheti sites analyzed by ourselves as well, but mostly by other people, which exploited the different sources located in Armenia, in southern Georgia, and in Turkey. Other work in process is the one about the composition of beads of artificial materials, so-called paste, and pottery fabric. And finally, trace analysis on chipolithics and bone objects, and now macrolithics as well is planned. Besides the standard uses of the tools, such as, for instance, for bone objects, we have already results. And besides standard use of the tools, such as piercing holes on leather for needles and cutting serials for flinted obsidian blades, the analysis revealed the relevance of less studied areas of craftsmanship, such as that of basketry on the right, and processing swamp reeds, which appear to have been quite important in some of the settlements. So I would like to conclude this presentation by just briefly summarizing, mentioning the activities of the 2018-2021 seasons, which took place in the framework of the Georgian Italian Lagodekhi archaeological project, so the GLAP, which focuses on the Lagodekhi municipality in the area of the Alazani Plain. The project is, in fact, in direct connection with the previous one, as it addresses what happened? Well, it addresses an area in which previous research, what happens? Well, previous research showed the preeminent presence of two phases, the Chalcolithic and the early Kurgan period, for which our documentation in Shida Kartli was especially missing. On the contrary, there is apparently no KURA-ARAXES occupation here. So we thus hope, by using the same methodological approach, to integrate both to create one language sequence of the local cultures of the eastern, of the whole eastern Georgia. So shortly said, between 2018 and 2021, we excavated a relatively large Chalcolithic settlement of the Tsiteli-Gorebi cluster, Tsiteli-Gorebi 5. This turned out to belong to the very poorly known early Chalcolithic phase. All the dates cluster between 5000 and 4800 BC. In spite of the very poor state of preservation, this settlement proved extremely interesting, as it was because it was shown by geomagnetic prospection to have consisted of small raised islands of circular shape, this one in green, surrounded by ditches. The one that was best preserved and we could excavate something, gave remains of rectilinear architecture in cob technique, and very poorly preserved, and this is on the left is the filling of the ditch, and it also yielded an homogeneous assemblage of artifacts of this period, pottery, lithics, and so on. So as for the Bronze Age kurgans, which are the other very important archaeological remain of this area, until now we concentrated on mapping their occurrence by means of remote sensing assisted survey techniques in the very difficult and heavily forested environment of the Alazani Valley. This on the bottom left is one photo of how the kurgan appears now, so it's almost invisible even if you walk beside it. You can see it, you can see most of these kurgans from the satellite images, from vegetation discoloration, and we are trying to visit all of them. We are also carrying out some preliminary work aiming at identifying the possible presence of auxiliary structures, such as ceremonial roads, stone rings, tiny walls, or secondary burials in the proximity of the large kurgans. We don't think we will be able to excavate one of the large kurgans because they are too large for our possibilities. So all these, however, could be the topic for another lecture. And I think I have really already abused enough of your patience, so I prefer to stop my presentation here and leave some time for questions and discussions. There will be a short summary in Georgian by one of the Georgian members of our expedition, Giga Bakradze. So thank you very much for your attention, and here is a list of all the people, starting from the co-directors and especially all the experts to whom I owe the results of the, let's say, special analysis that I have been presenting the results here. So thank you very much for your attention again. And that's all.
Thank you, Elena, for the really complete and very interesting talk. And now we can leave the floor to your colleague.
Yeah.
Thank you, Elena.
Yeah. Giga?
Yes, yes. So if you would like, I think, yes, there is Levan and Tamar. I don't know who knows very well English. If they would like, I can read, or if then the record needs to listen someone, then in this case, of course, for sure, I can read in Georgian in any case. So as you would like. Okay, so, okay. მოგესალმებით. მე ვარ ერთ-ერთი წევრი იტალიურ ქართული არქეოლოგიური ექსპედიციის ლაგოდეხში და მე მოგახსენებთ 10 წლიან კვლევას საქართველოში პროფესორი ელენა როვას ხელმძღვანელობით. ვენეციის კაფოსკარის უნივერსიტეტი უკვე 10 წელზე მეტია მუშაობს აღმოსავლეთ საქართველოში სხვადასხვა ქართულ ინსტიტუტებთან ერთად, როგორიც არის საქართველოს ეროვნული მუზეუმი, ლაგოდეხის მუზეუმი და ამასთანავე თბილისის სახელმწიფო უნივერსიტეტი. ჩრდილოეთ მესოპოტამიის კვლევის ფარგლებში დადგინდა გარკვეული კავშირები ამ რეგიონსა და სამხრეთ კავკასიას შორის ამ მტკვარ-არაქსის პერიოდში, ასევე მტკვარ-არაქსსა და მის შემდგომ პერიოდებშიც და სწორედ მდინარე მტკვრის აუზში მუშაობდა არქეოლოგიური ჯგუფი სამ სხვადასხვა ძეგლზე, ეს იყო ოქერახევი, არადეთის, ორგორა, დოღლაური და ნატსარგორა. პირველი ამოცანა იყო, რომ შეგვეგროვებინა ყველა მასალა იმ უამრავი კონტექსტიდან და ქრონოლოგიური ფაზებიდან, რომელიც იყო წარმოდგენილი და დაგვედგინა ადგილობრივი პერიოდიზაცია, რომ ასევე შეგვედარებინა იმას, რაც გამოყენებული იყო მესოპოტამიისათვის. ამისთვის დაგვეხმარნენ აბსოლუტური ქრონოლოგიის ექსპერტიც, პროფესორი ბუარეტო, ვეიცმანის მეცნიერების ინსტიტუტი, რომელმაც ხელმძღვანელად C14-ით პერიოდიზაციას, ასევე კერამიკის მნიშვნელოვანი ნაწილი თარიღდებოდა მტკვარ-არაქსის პერიოდით, ეს არის ძველი წელთაღრიცხვით 3100-2800 წლები, ასევე გარდამავალი პერიოდით შუაბრინჯაოსა და გვიანბრინჯაოს პერიოდებს შორის ძველი წელთაღრიცხვით 1500-700 წლები და ანალიზებმა ცალსახად გვაჩვენა, რომ ყველა მრავალფენიან ძეგლს საკმაოდ დარღვეული სტრატიგრაფია აქვს და ეს გამოწვეულია სხვადასხვა დროს არსებული ეტაპობრივი განსახლებებისა და ძეგლის მიტოვებისგან, ძეგლზე ცხოვრების შეწყვეტისაგან. პროექტის სხვადასხვა პერიოდში ჩატარებული კვლევების ძირითადი შედეგები შესაძლოა ასე შეჯამდეს, რომ მტკვარ-არაქსის პერიოდის მონაცემები შეგროვებული იყო ნატსარგორასა და არადეთის ორგორიდან და დასაკრძალავი ადგილიდან, ეს იყო ნატსარგორასა და დოღლაურზე. არადეთის ორგორა შემთხვევაში არის პატარა, მაგრამ მნიშვნელოვანი რეგიონალური ცენტრი. ეს არის 4 მეტრის სიმაღლის მტკვარ-არაქსული ნამოსახლარი, შესაძლოა დაყოფილი იქნას 6 მთავარ საცხოვრებელ დონედ. აქ შემორჩენილია საყოფაცხოვრებო ნაშთები და მშენებლობის განსხვავებული ტექნიკა. ყველაზე მნიშვნელოვანი აღმოჩენა იყო პატარა ზომის სალოცავი, რომლის ძირზეც მიგნებული იქნა ორი ზოომორფული ვაზისათვის. მისმა პალინოლოგიურმა ანალიზმა აჩვენა, რომ იგი გამოყენებული იყო ღვინის შესანახად, სავარაუდოდ უნდა ის უკავშირდებოდეს სარიტუალო მიზნებს. ხაშურის ნატსარგორა არის პატარა გორა, რომელიც მდებარეობს მტკვრის ველიდან 7 კილომეტრის დაშორებით. იგი მცირე პერიოდის განმავლობაში წარმოადგენდა მტკვარ-არაქსულ სოფელს და ზედაპირის მიკრომორფოლოგიურმა ანალიზმა გვაჩვენა, რომ ტერიტორია ძირითადად გამოყენებული იყო მარცვლეული კულტივირებისათვის, ასე ვთქვათ. მტკვარ-არაქსის დაკრძალვის ტრადიციები შესწავლილი იქნა ორი დასაკრძალავი ადგილის შესწავლის საფუძველზე. ორივე ნატსარგორა და არადეთის ორგორა გაითხარა ქართული ჯგუფების მიერ. დაკრძალვის ერთადერთ ტიპს წარმოადგენდა ის ორმოსამარხები, ეს იყო რიყის ქვებით გარშემორტყმული ორმოსამარხები და ერთადერთი განსხვავება არის ის, რომ კოლექტიური სამარხები უფრო მეტად დამახასიათებელია არადეთისათვის, ვიდრე ნატსარგორისათვის. შეწირული მასალა მეტწილად ერთნაირია, ეს არის ოსტეოლოგიური და სედიმენტის მულტიდისციპლინარული ანალიზი, რომელიც მოპოვებული იქნა სამარხებიდან და ჯერ კიდევ კვლევის პროცესში. მტკვარ-არაქსის შემდგომი პერიოდის არსებობა მიკვლეულია ორივე ნამოსახლარზე, თუმცა მოპოვებულია ძალზე მცირე მასალები. ნაცარგორის ნამოსახლარის მტკვარ-არაქსული სოფლის მიტოვების შემდგომ აქ ცხოვრება განახლდა ბედენის კულტურის არსებობის დროს, რაც გვიდასტურებს ამ პერიოდისათვის დამახასიათებელი ორმოების არსებობა და სპეციფიური კერამიკის ნიმუშების აღმოჩენა და სხვადასხვა ასევე ზებუნებრივი არსებების რელიეფური გამოსახულებები. ეს ნამოსახლარები შესაძლებელია გამოყენებული იყოს სარიტუალო ცერემონიებისათვის და ბედენის კულტურა ზოგადად არადეთის ორგორაზე უფრო მძლავრი უნდა ყოფილიყო, თუმცა გათხრილმა ზედაპირმა გვაჩვენა, რომ იგი დაფარული იყო კერამიკის მცირე ნატეხებით. დასაკრძალავი არტეფაქტები ძალზე მწირია, თუმცა საინტერესო. და ოხერახევში გათხრილი ასევე პატარა ბედენური ყორღანი, რომელიც ტიპიურია ამ პერიოდის ყორღანებისა. ბედენის ქვიანი ორმოსამარხები დოღლაურიდან ფორმებით ძალიან ჰგავს მტკვარ-არაქსის სამარხებს. ეს იმის მანიშნებელია, რომ შიდა ქართლის ადრეული დამარხვის წესი სრულად არ გამქრალა ახალი ორგანული კულტურის გავრცელების გამო. მტკვარ-არაქსისა და ბედენის ორი კერამიკული ჯგუფის არქეომეტრიულ მასწავლებამ თვალსაჩინო განსხვავება დაგვანახა მათი დამუშავების ხარისხს, მასალას, ზედაპირის დამუშავებასა და გამოწვრის ტექნოლოგიას შორის. ორივე შემთხვევაში გამოყენებულია ადგილობრივი თიხა. რაც შეეხება მეორე 1000 წლების პირველი ნახევარი საკმაოდ მწირადაა წარმოდგენილი არადეთის ორგორაზე და მხოლოდ თრიალეთის კულტურის რამდენიმე კერამიკა იქნა მიკვლეული. და მონაპოვარების საფუძველზე შეგვიძლია ვთქვათ, რომ აქ სხვადასხვა დროს ადამიანთა ჯგუფების დროებითი განსახლება მოხდა. ძველი წელთაღრიცხვით 1500-700 წლებით დათარიღებული მასალა გაცილებით მრავლად არის მიკვლეული და მთავარი საკითხი არის სხვადასხვა არქეოლოგიური კულტურების განსაზღვრა, ეს არის ჭაშენ წითელგორები და სამთავრო და ქრონოლოგიური და გეოგრაფიული კავშირები მათ შორის. არადეთის ორგორის ადრეული ნაწილი გათხრილი იყო მხოლოდ პატარა ჭრილებით, რომლებიც საშუალებას გვაძლევდა დაგვენახა მისი გვიანდელი ნაწილიც. რკინისხელის მასალებიდან ძალიან მცირე რაოდენობა აღმოჩენილი ძეგლზე არის აღმოჩენილი და ძეგლზე ცხოვრება უკვე სრული განსახლება არსებობდა უკვე ძველი წელთაღრიცხვით 700 წლიდან მის ელინისტურ პერიოდამდე. და ასევე ადრებრინჯა შუაბრინჯაოს ხანიდან უბრალოდ ის ადრებრინჯაოს ხანამდე და განსაკუთრებით ძველი წელთაღრიცხვის 16-15 საუკუნეებში და ამ პერიოდში უკვე შემოდის ჩარხზე დამზადებული კერამიკა, რაც კიდევ უფრო მეტ საშუალებას გვაძლევს, რომ იგი დავათარიღოთ ადრეული ბრინჯაოს ხანით. ძველი წელთაღრიცხვის მე-12 საუკუნიდან ჩნდება ეგრეთ წოდებული მერიღელეს ტიპის ვაზები, რის შემდგომაც ჩნდება უკვე ზოომორფული სახელურებიანი და უფრო ფართო თასები. ეს მანიშნებელია, რომ რკინისხანის ის ადგილობრივი კერამიკული ტრადიციის დაწყების, ასე ვთქვათ, რომელიც უკვე სამთავროს კულტურას წარმოადგენს. გვიანბრინჯაო ადრერკინის ხანაში მთელს რეგიონში შეინიშნება ძეგლზე ცხოვრების განახლება, მათ შორის არადეთის ორგორასა და ნაცარგორაზეც. არადეთის ორგორა ეს არის ეს პროცესი, ანუ სამგორაზე ეს პროცესი ჭაშენ წითელგორის კულტურის დროს ახდენს კულმინაციას და ამ პერიოდში ხვდებით მონუმენტური არქიტექტურის მაგალითებსაც. მასიურ ტერასულ მშენებლობებს, სახლებში კერების არსებობას და მსგავსი ტიპის სახლები გვიაბრინჯაოთ ადრერკინის ხანაში გავრცელებულია უკვე სამხრეთ კავკასიაში. ზორიდან ერთი გათხრილი არეა შეიცავდა ფართო პლატფორმებს, რომელზეც განთავსებული იყო ღუმელები, ასევე დიდი რაოდენობით ზედაპირული ორმოები, ღია სივრცეები შეინიშნებოდა, რომლის ზედაფენა იყო არეული და გამოიყენებოდა ასევე სხვადასხვა შინაური ცხოველებისათვის. ეს მიუხედავად იმას, რომ აქ საკვების მომზადება ხდებოდა არა ინდივიდუალურად ოჯახის დონეზე, არამედ უკვე მასშტაბურად და ასევე მიკვლეულია პატარა მოედნისათვის, სადაც აღმოჩენილია სხვადასხვა ცხოველისა თუ ფრინველის ძვლები, რაც გვავარაუდებინებს, რომ ადგილი გამოყენებული იყო სარიტუალო ცერემონიებისათვის. შიდა ქართლში წარმოებული 10 წლიანი ექსპედიციების მულტიდისციპლინარულ მკვლევარებმა შესაძლებლობა მოგცა დაგვედგინა სხვადასხვა მოვლენის ევოლუცია, გვიანბრინჯაოდან ის ადრერკინის ხანამდე, ასეთები იყო გამოსაწვავი ღუმელები, დასაკრძალავი ადგილები და სხვა კვლევები მოიცავდა ობსიდიანის კვლევას, სამკაულისა და კერამიკის დამუშავებას, ქვისა და ძვლის იარაღების კვალის ანალიზს. 2018-21 წლებში არქეოლოგიურმა სამუშაოებმა გადაინაცვლა ლაგოდეხის მუნიციპალიტეტში და ქართულ-იტალიური ლაგოდეხის არქეოლოგიური პროექტის ფარგლებში და ის პირდაპირ კავშირშია წინა პროექტთან და მისი საშუალებით ვიკლოთ ხალკოლითისა და ადრეყორღანულ პერიოდს, რომელიც შიდა ქართლში ნაკლებად იყო წარმოდგენილი. 3 სეზონის განმავლობაში მიმდინარეობდა გათხრები ფართო ხალკოლითურ ძეგლზე წითელი გორები 5 და აღმოჩნდა რომ ძეგლი ეკუთვნის იშვიათ ხალკოლითურ ფაზას, ძველი წელთაღრიცხვით 5000-2800 წლები და ძეგლზე გეომაგნიტური კვლევით გამოვლინდა მრავალი თხრილები, რომლებიც განლაგებულია სწორხაზოვან არქიტექტურასთან და შეიცავს ქვისა და კერამიკის მრავალ ჯგუფს. ბრინჯაოს ხანის ყორღანებისთვის ამ ეტაპზე რუკაზე მონიშნული გვაქვს სხვადასხვა ადგილები, რომლებიც დაზვერვების დროს გამოიკვეთა და წინასწარი სამუშაოების ჩატარებისთვის მიზნად ისახავს მათ სიახლოვეს მყოფი სხვადასხვა ნაგებობების შესაძლო არსებობის იდენტიფიკაციას. მადლობა. Thank you.